made it to the water.
Hey guys, I hope you're all doing great. So BFA has been out for about a month now, and I wanted to wait until all the major features like WARFRONTS and the Uldir raid were released before making this video, including the recent AMA that Ian did. For many of us, the question is still up in the air. What exactly is up with the current expansion? And is BFA worth playing right now? In this video, I'm going to try and cover all the major pros and cons of the expansion in as neutral a view as possible, and then I'll let you guys know exactly what my stance is on this question. Feel free to agree or disagree with me on any of these, and definitely leave me a comment below on whether you're having fun in BFA and how you think that the expansion could be improved. We're going to go through 3 categories: what's good, what could be improved, and what I feel is all out bad. Let's start with what's good first. Again, I would like to emphasize that this is my own opinion, coming from someone who has played over a decade of WoW since vanilla, is a semi-hardcore raider, and a regular non-rated PvPer. Number 1. The story. I think it's been pretty unanimous among the community that the story of BFA is one of the better ones. For the Horde, we are introduced to an exotic and foreign civilization, the Zandalari Empire, a larger-than-life fairy tale that includes beasts of epic proportions. We are thrust into a completely new world, and yet the characters, while somewhat simplistic, are still relatable and memorable. These are characters that I will probably remember way longer and fonder than those in Legion, for example, which I have regrettably already forgotten about, besides the ones in Suramar. For the Alliance, we are reintroduced to none other than Jaina Proudmoore and her home nation, Kul Tiras. I really like the way she has progressed, from her arguably heartbroken and vengeful personality to her now stoic and determined attitude. From her actions, we see that above all she cares about her people, whether they be from the Alliance or Kul Tiras, over any warmongering tendencies that have been accused against her. Overall, it was a fantastic journey into her mindset and her own mini redemption arc towards her own family and people. Now don't get me wrong, I'm in no way saying that the story of Battle for Azeroth is the best in WoW's history, but it's definitely something you want to experience if the story of the game is something for you. Number 2. The art and music. I combined these 2 categories into one, even though each of the teams that worked on these deserve a full 5 stars from me. As you journey through the Horde or Alliance continents, the scenery and the musical ambience just bring you to another place entirely. Rarely in WoW has such a fine masterpiece ever been constructed together. I still find myself very often listening to the background music, and considering how I listen to Spotify while playing most of my games, that says a lot. The sense of scale is fantastic, and the feeling of immersion of being in a completely different world for the Horde and being brought back to medieval times for the Alliance is excellent. Kudos to the art and music team of Blizzard. Number 3. The dungeons and raids. The dungeons and raids in BFA were well done. Again, this isn't an opinion coming from someone that is trying to chase the highest level of keys or vying for world first in downing bosses, but from someone that regularly clears heroic raids and sometimes mythic. I feel that there is enough of a variety of dungeon types and mobs, from giant dinosaur temples to ghostly prisons, and enough of a variety of interesting mechanics, such as the mother fight in Uldir, the odd placements of Gehun, or being all out chased by a crazy land shark, to warrant a good review for them. The story and war campaign also link up pretty well with the various dungeons, to the point whereby it becomes a little confusing for the opposing faction who has not experienced the other faction's storyline, and vice versa. This is a good thing, rather than having arbitrary dungeons filled with mobs for the sake of having them. WoW in general has always done well in the way that they design their dungeons and raids, even for the abysmal expansion that was WOD, so a thumbs up from me for this. Number 4. World PvP. Now we head into one of the biggest overhauls in WoW's history, the implementation of World PvP and the ability to opt into or out of it. I think this was one of the best changes to WoW bar none. It allowed those of us who wanted a more peaceful leveling or questing experience to journey alongside members of the opposing faction amicably by simply unflagging. And on the flip side, it allowed those of us who longed for a real open world PvP experience to encounter enemy players that also desired a fight. No longer are there dynamics of griefing or ganking, as every player that opts into world PvP is a valid target. While the 10% buff might still be an issue of contention for some, I personally felt that it was a well-deserved reward, an added incentive for constantly having to look over one's shoulder and often having to bring talents to quests that weren't optimal for PvE but great for PvP. Number 5. Finally, we have the implementation of epic battlegrounds, splitting up Alterac Valley and Isle of Conquest from their smaller cousins. For someone like myself that participates regularly in BGs, this was an absolutely beautiful change. Players either used to love or hate being randomly queued into such large battlegrounds, leading to either a low level of teamwork and gameplay or outright AFKing and toxicity. But now, most that queue into this category are looking to actually PvP in such an environment. It has led to much better matches with players utilizing the various tactics much better. The Epic Battleground category has definitely improved the battleground experience for not only the large BGs but the smaller ones too. So those are the aspects that I think Blizz has absolutely nailed on the head. Now let's get into the next category, things that could be improved. Let's tackle the biggest one first, Azerite armor. Many of us are in unison in claiming that this system is too boring and simplistic. On this, I am with you. Firstly, an overwhelming majority of the skills that Azerite armor provides are passive by nature. They simply slap on an extra percentage of flat damage amount to your existing skills, providing no added layer of gameplay or complexity whatsoever. To go from our old talent trees in Vanilla to Wrath, to our armor tier set bonuses in every single expansion, to artifact weapons in Legion, to this, I believe that the pruning got way out of hand this time around. Everything about this system screams that it was just slipshod or simply a rushed product. Perhaps Blizzard had initially wanted all of the Azerite traits on the armor to be class specific, but due to the lack of time or the need to make the deadline, decided to generalize all of them into insignificant traits that added nothing interesting whatsoever. This was made even more obvious in the recent Q&A about how future plans were going to entail adding more class specific traits to the system. These so-called future plans should have been implemented at the release of the game, and not until a future patch. Azerite armor should have felt like artifact weapons at the very least, having a whole plethora of skills for us to build upon and customize. To make matters worse, the dynamic of having cookie cutter builds for each spec is still here to stay, despite having a drastically lower number of trait choices, completely contradicting how Ian explicitly stated in a previous Q&A that a higher eye level item should almost always mean that you can replace your existing item. In almost all ways, Azerite armor is a step backwards from what we used to have. In a sense, Legion 0.5. If someone completely new to WoW were given these systems and asked to guess their chronological order, I have no doubt that they would put Azerite armor as the expansion before artifact weapons. There is perhaps a silver lining though to this entire debacle. Ian has consistently stated that they are now in the mindset of planning for the long term, and no longer planned each expansion in isolation but with the next one in mind. He also mentioned that such a heavy level of pruning was required, a short-term tearing off of the band-aid so to speak, for the sake of the long-term health of the game. They simply couldn't just keep adding abilities to classes, and needed to turn over a new leaf so to speak, in BFA. I find some legitimacy in this reasoning, and in theory it is sound. However, it does not serve as an excuse to serve out a product to your customers that is not as good as to what they are used to paying for. If such an action had to be taken, the onus would be on Blizzard to instead extend the testing phase of their product, that is the alpha and beta stages, and to improve on the product with a small group of testers then and there before shipping it out. I cannot help but feel like this, and many of the following points that we'll be covering in this video, stings of incompetency and smells badly of a rushed product. Number 2. The World Quest and the rep grind. This would be the second biggest gripe that players are currently upset about in BFA. BFA has placed such a heavy emphasis upon the reputation grind, linking it to key aspects of the game such as unlocking flight points, upgrading your AZERITE necklace, and unlocking the new allied races, that the majority of the game has turned into a world quest simulator, almost to the level of a mobile game. The problem with this process isn't necessarily the world quest system per se, but in the reward structure. In other words, the grind is fine, it's more that it doesn't feel rewarding. World quests were first introduced in Legion, and as a brand new feature of that expansion, I felt that they were pretty well designed. They provided sizable monetary rewards, or artifact power on a scale that actually meant something. PvP world quests were also a thing, which honestly I have no idea why there aren't any in BFA when world PvP is a thing, but I'll get to that later. Allowing you to grind out honor for attractive titles and artifact appearances. Reputation was in no way the primary rewards of world quests, but a secondary bonus leading to cosmetic rewards from each faction's quartermaster. It had very little if anything to do with actual progression, as it has always been for over a decade of WoW. Why in the world they would choose to deviate so far from this system when they were already receiving conflicting feedback about the time-gated reputation requirements for the allied races introduced in Legion is beyond me. To make matters worse, none of the reputations or rewards that you earn carry over onto your alts. If you were to level a new character or decide to reroll your main, you would have to do this entire process all over again. That doesn't feel rewarding at all. This was addressed in the recent Q&A by Ian, but honestly it felt more like a rehashed corporate reply than anything. He was neither answering the question nor providing potential solutions, besides a vague catch-up mechanic for the Champions of Azeroth rep in a future patch. He provided no insight whatsoever on the direction of the game towards reputations, alts, or gearing up, and seemed to be thinking out loud more than anything. Very few people enjoy time-gated reputation grinds. The grind could be insanely difficult, just like the Dark Iron reputation grind in vanilla, the PvP honorable kills and battleground reputation achievements, or the insane in the membrane achievement. Just don't make it time-gated. Even worse, to make it time-gated and now tied to gear progression. It only leads to conclusions being drawn of a cash grab, that Blizzard simply wants us to arbitrarily pay more over a longer period of time to unlock the same level of rewards. Number 3. The leveling experience. The leveling experience, mechanically, is also close to a disaster, and I don't use that term lightly. There is currently no sense of progression in going from level 110 to 120, and to make matters worse, it feels extremely underwhelming, especially past the level 116 point, whereby your legendaries from Legion lose their effects. In any game, and especially a game that is rooted in RPG elements, one's hero or character is supposed to feel more powerful as they level up. It gives a purpose to the adventure, a feeling of progression, and more importantly, that rewarding feeling. That feeling of power doesn't need to occur linearly in terms of the enemies becoming weaker and less challenging, but it can occur laterally in terms of the hero gaining new abilities and spells to augment his or her fighting ability. Currently, none of this exists. There is no new talent roll, your character gets exponentially weaker as he or she levels up, to the point whereby taking on a few normal level mobs at a time becomes challenging for a few specs. The level gap simply seems to be there to fulfill the arbitrary need for a level increase every expansion. From a developer standpoint, I somewhat understand why this had to happen. The mobs at level 120 were designed with late game gear in mind, causing a fresh 120 to hit like a complete wet noodle. But then, the question I ask would be, why apply this same restriction to levels 110 to 119? Why apply an endgame consideration to the leveling experience? Was it with the consideration of world PvP in mind, so that a player below 120 would not completely trash a level 120? If that were the case, then that is an even more unacceptable reason. As much as I love PvP and the new world PvP elements, such considerations should not trump something as fundamental and intrinsic to the experience of the expansion as is the leveling experience. A new solution should have been found for this painful journey, rather than to tell the player base that it is something that they should simply suffer through for the short term. Personally, it has reached a stage for me, as I'm sure it has for many others, to no longer feel the desire or attraction of leveling our alts, as it has become more of a painful necessity rather than an enjoyable experience. Number 4. Now we come to the topic of Warfronts. I would like to begin by stating that I enjoy the concept of Warfronts. I really do. I think that the idea is novel and that they are a much needed fresh PvE perspective for WoW. My issue with them is that they seemed very much like a foundational concept that was released for testing by the player base, rather than a finished comprehensive product. The first major issue is that we can only access them once every 3.5 weeks, or close to a month. When coupled with the fact that Warfronts were one of the major marketing materials used to push forth BFA, this only resulted in major player disappointment. It was supposed to be the highlight of Battle for Azeroth, an expansion all about the two factions going to war on multiple fronts. At the very least, Warfronts should be something that players get to experience weekly, and even then, a 30-minute event once a week is still a little lackluster. There was a reason for this though, as was revealed in the recent Q&A. The long-term plan was for multiple Warfronts to be released over the course of BFA, allowing players access to several Warfronts over a much shorter cycle of time. And that sounds great. The problem with this is that this is for the long term, for later on in the game, months or perhaps even a year later. What about short-term considerations? Not to sound harsh, but we are all paying a monthly subscription for this game, whether it be through real money or gold. The Alliance isn't even going to be able to experience the Warfronts for a couple of weeks, nearly a month and a half after the release of the game. When compounded with the fact that all PvE non-raiding content revolves around world quests, this becomes a big problem. Again, not to sound like a broken record, but it again stings of a rushed product. It hints strongly of a heavily marketed and highly attractive expansion feature that was released with little consideration towards the everyday concerns of the paying customer base. In other words, why am I logging in today? The second major issue is that they seem very much like a rehashed version of LFR raids. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think there's anything wrong at all with the LFR version of raids. It allows all of us, regardless of our time commitment to the game, to experience the raiding scene on a certain level, which is great. But I in no way whatsoever think that an entire expansion feature should only be released with an LFR version. In its current iteration, we cannot queue up for Warfronts as a raid group. This makes no sense to me whatsoever, as for those of us who have experienced Warfronts, the entire campaign revolves around working together in split groups on multiple fronts to defeat the final boss. In other words, teamwork is required. There is so much potential for the Warfronts as a concept to be split into multiple tiers of difficulties, just like raids and dungeons. An LFR version, which is what it currently is, a normal version, a heroic version, and perhaps even a mythic version. It will provide such a fantastic alternative to the original concept of raiding that has been with us since vanilla, and it would enable teams of friends or guilds to experience a dynamically different form of PvE content. But for whatever reason, we are simply stuck with this one, an AFK version whereby we can simply all just AFK for the free loot. Again, this simply stinks of a rushed product, a viable concept that they did not have enough time to fully test, and thus just pushed out onto the live game to let their paying customer base test out the LFR/AFK/almost impossible to be defeated version for them. On a certain level, it is almost slightly insulting. Number 5. Island Expeditions. And of course, we come to Island Expeditions, the second most marketed feature of BFA that has seemingly turned out into yet another lackluster feature. Like WARFRONTS, I actually enjoy the concept of the Island Expeditions. They are a nice throwback to the 3-man scenarios we used to have in Mists of Pandaria, and conceptually should have been a nice viable alternative for a small group of friends to experience another version of content. Unfortunately, the way it has been handled and released in the past month has not been the best. The reward scheme up until recently felt, well, unrewarding. All they gave was AZERITE power with a minute chance of rares and pets dropping. There was little to no incentive to do them beyond the amount that was required for the weekly. In addition to this, I felt like the new AI that was expounded upon didn't really feel all that novel. I didn't feel any noticeable difference in the way the mobs acted, and if I hadn't known beforehand that there was a new AI in place, I wouldn't have suspected anything at all. Yet again, this feels like a concept that sounded great in theory, and don't get me wrong, I think it does, but didn't have enough time to be tested upon and tweaked upon. Nevertheless, I personally feel that Island Expeditions are one of the smaller issues of BFA, considering how many other bigger problems exist. Most of what is required is a tweak to the reward structure, which we have already seen happening. And so those are what I feel are the features that were conceptually great, but have a lot of room for improvement in BFA. Now we come to the category that I feel is all out just, and I hesitate to use this term, but I strongly feel that Blizzard deserves this criticism. Bad. And I have only placed 1 point in this category. 1. Class balance and design. I would like to preface this section by stating that I am well aware that almost every WoW expansion brings with it a host of problems in class balancing. For example, Survival and Feral were completely unviable for the majority of Legion. Demon Hunters and Death Knights were completely broken, especially PvP wise, when Legion and Wrath were first released. These things happen, I get it. Nevertheless, 2 wrongs do not make a right. It is still inexcusable, no matter how many times it happens, to release an expansion with unfinished specs or classes. Let's make no mistake about this. Blizzard is charging us a full price for a broken product. To make matters worse, the number of classes and specs that are outrightly bland and lagging far behind other specs in BFA is, without sugarcoating anything, atrocious. Some classes and specs were so far behind others that in the first month of gearing in dungeons, it was an absolute torture for them. And we all know how crucial the first month of gearing is to those that want to progress with their guilds in raiding. The most aggravating part of all of this is that months upon months of genuine feedback was supplied to Blizzard during alpha and beta testing of these exact issues. Pages upon pages of suggestions on the forums, an endless stream of improvements and ideas of how to move forward with the classes. Well thought out arguments with class balance considerations in mind, and yet nothing was done about them. An overwhelming majority of the testers knew that something was critically wrong with the Shaman class. Something was terribly broken about the AoE capabilities of the Feral, that Shadow Priests were going to be in need of an overhaul after losing their artifact weapons, and the list goes on. Blizzard is simply no longer the company that will delay a product until it is ready. It is not. It has never been since the catastrophic release of Diablo 3, and I say this with a very heavy heart. There is a whole slew of issues I could continue on about class balancing, but I'll simply wrap it up with this. Legion had about an entire year of alpha and beta testing before it was released. In comparison, BFA only had about 6 months. Many were shocked when the release date was announced. Almost every tester on the beta knew that the game was not ready to be released, and yet it was. With all that being said, there are a few theories as to why all this is happening. The first is that Blizzard doesn't care. I disagree with this. I think Blizzard very much cares, but only certain parts of Blizzard. I am positive that there are passionate developers working their butts off to make WoW the most fun and rewarding experience that any of us has ever had the privilege to enjoy in our lives. However, as I've hinted numerous times throughout the video, I think it's hard to deny that Battle for Azeroth was a rushed product. Almost everything points towards it, whether it be from the fundamentally amazing concepts that just weren't well executed, numerous bugs that at times resulted in game-breaking consequences, and to classes and specs just not being ready for release. I also don't think that this has anything to do with the theories that Blizzard is now catering to a different player base. I see little evidence of this. WoW has in recent history been a game that has catered very much to the casual player base, as that is the bread and butter of their subscription income. And all the features point towards this, from the catch-up mechanics to the ease of entering and accessing every part of the game. And so I come to the conclusion of all of this, the answer to the question that I placed in the thumbnail: should you stay subbed to WoW? And for that, I have this to say. As someone who loves this game with all his heart, as someone whose childhood was built upon this game, as someone who has even made multiple YouTube videos to share this amazing game with you guys, it is with the heaviest of hearts for me to tell you that if you don't have friends logging in to play with you, to do dungeons and raids with you, to PvP with you, and if you feel a general sense that you just aren't really having fun playing the game, then perhaps this is the time to unsub. Never have I personally felt so empty when logging on so close to an expansion's release, with so little to actually look forward to doing in the game. Never have I felt this desire to actually play other games other than WoW so close to an expansion's release. WoW is a game that I can play day in and out without touching any other game for months on end. But this time, it feels a little different. Personally though, I will be staying subbed because I have an amazing guild to experience and progress the content with, no matter how dull it may be. The game simply isn't ready, and it often doesn't feel fun, polished, or fine in many aspects. It truly feels like beta for Azeroth right now, and Blizzard needs to understand that its loyal customer base will not stand to pay a full price for such an unfinished product. The game will improve later down the line. The sky isn't falling. This is not WOD 2.0. It is not so much a lost cause, but simply a rushed one. However, seeing as how many of its flaws are systematic in nature, its redemption may only come about months from now. It may be in 8.1 or maybe even 8.2. But don't stay subbed to this game right now if you don't find it fun. Come back when it is glorious again, like how Legion felt after WOD. Now don't get me wrong, when Legion started, it was pretty bad. Off-specs weren't a thing, as the artifact power grind was just too insane to accommodate off-specs. You also needed specific legendaries in order for your spec to do well or even work in some cases, leading to major complaints about how RNG was severely hampering the gameplay experience for everyone. But, and this is a big but, while Legion was grindy, there was little to no arbitrary time-gated grind, and it felt like a polished product with flawed conceptual decisions. In comparison, right now, BFA is an unpolished product with flawed conceptual decisions. I hope I was able to provide a clear and unbiased view into the various features of BFA, and I hope that this video didn't come about as overly negative, but I felt a strong need to be honest in this review. Whether you agree with me or not, definitely feel free to leave a comment below to let me know how you feel. As always, thank you for watching, and for those of you that will remain subbed to BFA, I'll see you in Azeroth.